In Redwood Crossing, silence was louder than any gunshot anyone ever dared to imagine, and on that dusty afternoon, Emily Carter learned that truth the moment her satchel slipped from her shoulder and no one reached out to help her. The wooden boardwalk beneath her feet felt too long, too empty, as if the town itself had decided to look away at the exact second she needed it to look forward. Duke Mallory didn't rush, didn't need to. He moved like someone who already understood the rules of this place, rules no one ever wrote down but everyone obeyed without question. With a slow, confident motion, he took what didn't belong to him, folding it into his coat like it was just another ordinary transaction in Redwood Crossing. Emily's fingers trembled as she tried to pull her satchel back, but it was already too late, and the sound of soft laughter from the surrounding crowd made it worse than the act itself. Men leaned against posts, women paused at windows, even the boy sweeping dust near the general store froze mid-motion, all of them watching as if distance made them innocent. Not a single voice rose. Not a single step broke forward. It was not chaos that ruled this town, but agreement disguised as fear. Emily tried to speak, but her words disappeared into the heat rising off the street. Duke finally straightened, adjusting his coat as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and that was when he looked at her with a calm certainty that made her stomach tighten. "You should be more careful," he said casually, as though he were offering advice instead of taking everything she had worked for. Around them, the crowd reacted with quiet amusement, the kind that comes when people are too afraid to disagree but too comfortable to care. Emily took one step back, then another, until the rough wood beneath the boardwalk gave way to dirt, and even then no one moved to stand beside her. Across the street, Ethan Brooks had just ridden into Redwood Crossing without fanfare, his horse slowing as if sensing something the town refused to admit. He did not dismount immediately. He simply looked. And what he saw was not just a woman standing alone, but an entire town choosing silence as its language. Duke's voice carried again, louder now, as he addressed no one in particular, saying that order had to be maintained and people like Emily always misunderstood where they stood in places like this. A few chuckles followed, thin and uncertain, like dry branches breaking under pressure. Emily's knees nearly gave out as she tried to steady herself, her hands pressing against the edge of the boardwalk for support, but even then, the space around her remained empty of help. Ethan finally stepped down from his horse. Slowly. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a kind of stillness that made even the dust seem to pause midair. His boots touched the ground without sound, yet somehow the entire street shifted. Conversations died mid-word. Movement slowed. Duke noticed him only after the silence changed shape, and when he turned, he saw a man who had not yet spoken a single word but had already disrupted everything the town depended on. Ethan's gaze moved past Duke, past the crowd, and settled on Emily for a moment that felt longer than it should have, as if he was measuring something no one else had bothered to see. Then, without raising his voice, without asking permission from a place that had already refused it to others, he took one step forward into the center of Redwood Crossing, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for what would happen next. The air in Redwood Crossing felt different the moment Ethan Brooks stepped fully into the street, not because anything had changed yet, but because something unspoken had finally been interrupted. The same people who had been watching Emily Carter moments ago now seemed unsure of where to place their attention, as if silence itself had become heavier and harder to maintain. Duke Mallory turned slowly, his expression shifting from casual confidence to measured curiosity, the kind of look a man wears when he realizes he is no longer the only one shaping the moment. Ethan did not speak right away. He simply looked at Emily, then at the crowd, and finally at Duke, as if weighing the entire town in a single glance. Emily remained near the edge of the boardwalk, her hand still trembling, her breathing uneven, but something in her posture had begun to change, not strength yet, but the first sign that she was no longer completely alone. Duke adjusted his coat again, trying to reclaim control through small familiar movements, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm that felt rehearsed rather than natural. He said this town had its ways, that misunderstandings happened when outsiders did not respect them, and a few scattered chuckles rose from the crowd like a habit no one knew how to stop. Ethan finally broke his silence with a voice that was steady but low, not loud enough to challenge the entire street, but clear enough that everyone heard it without needing to strain. He asked what exactly had been misunderstood. The question landed without force, yet it created a shift that was impossible to ignore. Duke narrowed his eyes, glancing briefly toward the watching townsfolk as if expecting support to reaffirm itself, but the same people who had laughed earlier were now still, studying the ground, the sky, anywhere but the center of the street. Emily took a cautious step forward, then stopped again, as if unsure whether she was allowed to exist closer to the conversation. Ethan did not look back at her yet, but his presence subtly adjusted the space around her, like a barrier forming without being drawn. Duke let out a short breath, almost a laugh, and said that the matter was simple, that Emily had lost something she could not afford to protect, and that in places like Redwood Crossing, people learned quickly what belonged to them and what did not. The words were not shouted, yet they carried enough weight to make the surrounding silence feel deliberate rather than accidental. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the logic behind that statement, then asked if ownership was determined by force or by right. The question was not rhetorical in tone, but it demanded reflection in a way the town was not used to giving. A man near the general store shifted his stance, then stopped, as if unsure where the movement itself might be noticed. Emily's eyes moved between Ethan and Duke, trying to understand not just what was happening, but what kind of person would step into a place like this and speak as if fear did not exist. Duke finally took a step forward, reducing the distance between himself and Ethan, but still keeping enough space to suggest control. He said quietly that strangers often misunderstood how things worked here, that silence was not agreement but survival, and that survival was something everyone eventually learned. Ethan's response was not immediate. He looked past Duke again, briefly scanning the crowd, and when he spoke, his words were calm but carried a different kind of weight, not authority, but certainty. He said survival without conscience was just another form of loss. For the first time, the crowd did not react at all, no laughter, no murmurs, just a shared stillness that felt unfamiliar. Emily took one more step forward, this time not stopping herself, and stood closer to Ethan than before, as if drawn by something she could not fully name. Duke's gaze tightened slightly, but his voice softened instead of rising, as though he was adjusting his approach rather than abandoning it. He said that ideals did not matter in Redwood Crossing, only outcomes did, and outcomes were already decided long before Ethan arrived. Ethan finally turned his head slightly toward Emily, acknowledging her presence fully for the first time, and in that moment, the silence of the town felt less like control and more like anticipation, as if every person there understood that something had already begun to shift beyond their ability to reverse it. The moment between Ethan Brooks and Emily Carter lingered in a way that made the entire street feel narrower, as if Redwood Crossing itself had leaned in to listen more closely. Emily stood just a few steps away now, her breathing steadier but still uneven, her eyes shifting between Ethan and Duke Mallory as if trying to understand which reality she was supposed to trust. Ethan did not move closer yet, but his presence had already changed the shape of the space around her, like a quiet line drawn in the dust that no one else dared to cross. Duke watched this carefully, his expression no longer casual, no longer amused, but measured, as if recalculating the situation based on variables he had not expected to exist. The crowd remained silent, but it was no longer the comfortable silence of indifference, it had become something tighter, more uncertain, like a held breath waiting for permission to release. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft and unsteady, asking if anyone was actually going to say anything or if this was just how things were always done here. Her words did not rise in volume, but they carried farther than expected because nothing else was competing with them. A few heads lowered in response, not in agreement, but in discomfort. Ethan turned slightly toward her then, acknowledging her question without rushing to answer it, and for the first time she saw something in him that felt less like authority and more like restraint, as if he was holding back not aggression, but clarity that could not be spoken too quickly. Duke let out a slow breath and said that talking did not change how towns survived, that survival depended on understanding limits, and that limits were something outsiders rarely respected until they were forced to. His tone was controlled, but there was a thin edge beneath it now, something that suggested he was aware the balance in the street was no longer entirely in his favor. Ethan responded by asking quietly what kind of survival required silence when someone was standing right in front of you needing help. The question was simple, but it seemed to settle over the street like dust after movement, making every person feel slightly exposed. Emily took another step closer to Ethan, no longer hesitating as much, though her hand still clutched the edge of her torn satchel as if it was the only remaining connection to what had just happened. Duke shifted his weight and glanced again at the crowd, but the familiar reassurance he usually found there was not returning to him in the same way. Instead, people avoided his gaze, not because they opposed him openly, but because they no longer seemed certain that staying silent was the safest option. Ethan finally turned his full attention back to Duke and said that taking something in front of witnesses who refused to speak did not make it acceptable, it only made the silence part of the problem. The words were not raised, but they carried a firmness that made several people in the back step slightly without realizing it. Duke's jaw tightened for a brief moment, then relaxed again as he tried to re-establish his usual composure, saying that the town had its own order and that order was not something adjusted for every passing visitor. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that point, then replied that order only held meaning if it protected people when it mattered most. Emily looked down at the ground as those words settled in, her expression shifting from confusion toward something closer to fragile understanding, as if she was realizing that what she had experienced was not just an isolated moment, but part of something larger that she had not yet learned the shape of. The crowd shifted again, subtle and almost imperceptible, like a single system reacting to pressure it could no longer distribute evenly. Duke looked at Ethan for a longer moment now, studying him not as a distraction anymore, but as a problem that would not disappear by being ignored. Ethan did not break eye contact, but he also did not escalate, remaining still in a way that made it unclear whether he was patient or simply certain. Emily finally stood fully upright, no longer leaning on the boardwalk, and when she spoke again it was quieter than before but more direct, asking Ethan if people like him ever stayed in places like this long enough to change anything or if they always just passed through. Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that silence, the weight of the entire street seemed to shift again, not toward resolution, but toward anticipation, as if something unseen had already begun moving just beyond the edge of what anyone there was ready to acknowledge. The question Emily Carter asked seemed to hang in the air longer than any sound in Redwood Crossing, not because it was loud, but because it forced something that the town had learned to avoid for a long time, reflection. Ethan Brooks finally shifted his gaze toward her fully, and for a brief moment there was no crowd, no Duke Mallory, no street, only the simple reality of a woman asking whether change was even possible in a place like this. He did not answer immediately, and that silence itself became the answer the town was not comfortable hearing. Duke watched this exchange closely, his stance tightening slightly, as if he could feel the structure of control beginning to loosen in small, invisible ways. Around them, the crowd remained still, but it was no longer unified in its stillness. Some people looked at the ground, others at the edges of buildings, a few at Ethan, but almost no one looked at Duke anymore. Emily adjusted her grip on her torn satchel, not because she needed it, but because it was something solid in a moment that no longer felt stable. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, saying that people did not always have to pass through places unchanged, but staying required more than presence, it required willingness. The word willingness lingered, and several people in the crowd shifted again, uncomfortable with how simple it sounded compared to how long they had accepted silence as normal. Duke let out a short breath and stepped slightly to the side, as if repositioning himself within the conversation rather than reacting to it. He said that willingness did not matter if the consequences were always the same, that towns like Redwood Crossing did not change because survival depended on predictability. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without agreeing with it, then said that predictability was only another word for repetition, and repetition was something people often confused with truth. Emily looked between the two men, realizing that what was unfolding was not just about her anymore, but about something the town had never been asked to question in this way. A quiet tension spread through the crowd, not dramatic, but steady, like a weight settling into unfamiliar positions. One man near the general store finally looked up fully, then quickly looked away again, as if unsure whether seeing too much would make him responsible for it. Duke's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained controlled as he said that outsiders often arrived believing they understood what fairness looked like, but fairness did not survive long in places that had to make difficult choices every day. Ethan responded without raising his voice, saying that difficulty did not justify silence when someone was standing right in front of you asking for acknowledgement. Emily's breathing slowed as those words reached her, and for the first time she seemed less like someone waiting to be helped and more like someone beginning to understand what had been missing all along. The space between Ethan and Duke felt narrower now, not physically, but in intent, as if the conversation itself was compressing the distance between them. Duke glanced briefly toward the crowd again, but the response he usually relied on was no longer immediate or reliable. Instead, there was hesitation, a collective uncertainty that had not been present before Ethan arrived. Emily took another step forward, now standing almost beside Ethan rather than behind him, and when she spoke again her voice was steadier, asking quietly why people would choose silence if they knew it allowed things like this to happen. The question was not directed at one person, but at the entire street, and that made it harder to ignore. Ethan did not interrupt her. Duke did not respond immediately. Even the wind seemed to slow for a moment as if listening. Finally, Duke said that choices were not always as simple as they appeared, that people survived by choosing what they could afford to risk, and most could not afford to risk everything for a single moment of principle. Ethan looked at him for a long moment before replying that a town built entirely on what people were afraid to risk would eventually forget what courage even looked like. Emily lowered her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that idea, and when she lifted them again, something had shifted in her expression, not resolution, but awareness. The crowd remained silent, yet the silence no longer felt like agreement. It felt like waiting. And in that waiting, something unspoken began to form, as if Redwood Crossing itself was standing at the edge of a decision it had avoided for far too long. The silence in Redwood Crossing had begun to change shape, no longer just a lack of sound but something heavier, something that pressed against every person standing along the wooden boardwalk as if the air itself had become aware of what was unfolding. Emily Carter remained close to Ethan Brooks now, not behind him, not separated, but just within the space where she could hear his voice without effort, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to make her uneasy. Ethan did not move much, but his stillness was no longer passive. It had become intentional, like a decision that did not need repetition to remain firm. Duke Mallory stood a few steps away, watching both of them with a controlled expression that no longer carried the same ease it had at the beginning of the encounter. The crowd behind him had not dispersed, but it had changed in presence, as if each person was reconsidering the value of their silence in real time. Emily finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before, asking why it felt like the entire town had agreed on something without ever actually saying it out loud. The question was simple, but it carried weight because it named what everyone had been avoiding acknowledging. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the space ahead, saying that unspoken agreements were often the strongest kind, not because they were right, but because they were repeated long enough to feel natural. Duke responded with a slow exhale, saying that nature was not built on fairness, and neither were towns like this, that people adapted or they disappeared, and adaptation always required compromise. A few heads in the crowd moved slightly at those words, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if they had heard that logic many times before and never been asked to examine it. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up, her expression shifting from confusion toward something more grounded, as if she was beginning to separate what she had accepted from what she had actually chosen. Ethan finally turned slightly toward Duke, asking whether survival built entirely on silence could still be called survival if it required people to ignore what was in front of them. The question did not rise in volume, but it removed certainty from the space between them. Duke's jaw tightened briefly, and for the first time he did not respond immediately, instead glancing toward the surrounding townspeople as if checking whether the structure he relied on was still intact. The crowd remained quiet, but their attention had changed direction, no longer anchored entirely to Duke, and that subtle shift was enough to alter the balance of the moment. Emily stepped slightly closer again, now fully beside Ethan, and when she spoke, her voice was steady enough to carry across the immediate space, asking if people here ever questioned what they were protecting when they stayed silent or if they only ever thought about what they were afraid to lose. That question lingered longer than expected, because it did not accuse anyone directly, yet it left no one untouched. A man near the far end of the street shifted his weight, then stopped, as if unsure whether even that small movement might be interpreted. Duke finally spoke again, saying that questioning things was easy for someone who did not have to live with the consequences of disruption, that order was fragile and had to be preserved carefully or it would collapse entirely. Ethan responded after a brief pause, saying that order that depended entirely on silence was already fragile, it was just being mistaken for stability. The words were calm, but they created a visible tension in the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakably present, like pressure building beneath a surface that had never been tested. Emily looked out across the street again, seeing now not just individuals but a pattern, a collective stillness that had shaped itself over time without ever being challenged. Duke took a slow step to the side, no longer directly blocking Ethan's line of sight, but still holding himself in a position that suggested authority he was not ready to release. Ethan did not follow him with movement, only with attention, and that attention alone seemed to make the space between them more defined. Emily finally said softly that it felt like no one here had ever been given permission to speak differently, and that realization seemed to settle into the ground beneath them like something long overdue. The crowd remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence that had opened this moment. It had become uncertain, unstable, and for the first time, it carried the feeling that it might not hold much longer without change. The wind moved through Redwood Crossing like it had finally remembered the street existed, carrying dust in slow circles that made the silence feel less empty and more intentional, as if even nature had begun listening to what Ethan Brooks and Duke Mallory were not saying directly. Emily Carter stood between them now in spirit rather than position, her presence no longer defined by what had happened to her but by the questions she was beginning to ask aloud, questions that no one in the town seemed prepared to answer without hesitation. Ethan remained steady, his attention divided not between threat and safety, but between truth and habit, as if he was studying not individuals but a system that had learned to function without speaking its real name. Duke shifted his stance again, smaller this time, not aggressive, but measured, like someone adjusting to a situation that was no longer following familiar rules. Emily's voice broke the silence again, softer than before, asking what happens to a place when everyone agrees not to speak even when they know something is wrong. The question did not carry accusation, only confusion, but that made it heavier because it reflected something many in the crowd had likely felt but never expressed. A long pause followed, one that stretched through the entire street, touching every listener without permission. Ethan finally spoke, saying that places did not change all at once, they changed in moments when someone decided that silence was no longer the only acceptable response, and those moments rarely announced themselves as important when they happened. Duke responded with a calm tone that felt increasingly strained at its edges, saying that change sounded simple when spoken about from a distance, but in practice it always came with instability, and instability always came with cost. A few people in the crowd shifted again, subtle movements that suggested discomfort more than agreement, as if the idea of cost was something they had been trained to prioritize over the idea of truth. Emily looked toward them briefly, then back to Ethan, asking quietly if that meant nothing could ever improve unless people were willing to risk everything at once. Ethan took a moment before answering, saying that improvement often began with something much smaller than risk. It began with acknowledgement, with refusing to let silence decide what was acceptable. Duke let out a short breath and said that acknowledgement did not feed families or protect livelihoods, and that was the reality people had to live within whether they liked it or not. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the reality without accepting its limitation, and replied that reality only stayed fixed as long as people agreed not to challenge its boundaries. Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, processing the weight of both perspectives, and when she looked up again, there was something different in her expression, not resolution yet, but a growing refusal to accept that silence was the only available language. The crowd remained still, but it was no longer uniform, small fractures of attention beginning to appear, as if individuals were no longer experiencing the moment collectively but separately, each interpreting the same silence in slightly different ways. Duke noticed this shift, and for the first time his gaze moved across the entire street rather than focusing only on Ethan, as if realizing that control was not just about one conversation but about the stability of everyone listening. Emily finally spoke again, asking if anyone here had ever actually tried speaking differently or if they had all simply inherited silence without questioning where it came from. That question lingered in the air longer than any of the previous ones, because it did not challenge a single action but the foundation beneath all of them. Ethan did not interrupt her, allowing the question to exist fully without correction or redirection. A man near the back of the crowd shifted his weight and looked briefly toward another man beside him, then looked away again, as if even silent acknowledgement between them carried weight. Duke said quietly that inheritance was how communities survived, that questioning inherited systems too often led to breaking things that could not easily be rebuilt. Ethan replied that inherited silence was still a choice when people continued to repeat it after they had recognized it. The word settled into the space between them, not as confrontation, but as reflection that could not be easily dismissed. Emily stood still now, no longer retreating into confusion, and for the first time she seemed to be observing not just what was happening to her, but what had always been happening around her without her noticing. The street remained quiet, but the nature of that quietness had changed again, no longer simply protective or habitual, but uncertain, as if Redwood Crossing itself was waiting to see whether the next moment would continue the pattern or finally begin to break it. The silence in Redwood Crossing had begun to feel less like stillness and more like a fragile surface stretched too thin over something unsettled beneath it, and as Ethan Brooks stood facing Duke Mallory, that tension became almost visible in the way people avoided looking directly at either man. Emily Carter remained close to Ethan now, not physically leaning on him, but positioned in a way that suggested she no longer felt entirely separated from what was unfolding. Duke's expression had grown increasingly controlled, but there was a subtle tension in his eyes that suggested he was no longer managing the moment as easily as before. Ethan's voice broke the silence again, calm and measured, asking whether a place could truly claim stability if its foundation depended on people refusing to acknowledge what they saw with their own eyes. The question did not rise in volume, yet it seemed to carry further than expected, touching the edges of the gathered crowd in a way that made several people shift their stance almost unconsciously. Emily turned slightly toward Ethan, then toward the crowd, and for the first time she seemed to be observing not just the individuals around her, but the structure they collectively formed without ever openly agreeing to it. Duke responded after a brief pause, saying that stability was not built on perfect fairness but on shared understanding of limits, and that without those limits, communities would dissolve into uncertainty. A few murmurs almost formed in the crowd but faded before becoming sound, as if people were testing whether agreement still felt automatic or if it now required thought. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the idea without conceding it, then said that limits only held meaning when they protected people rather than simply restricting them. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, as if replaying everything she had experienced since stepping into this street, and when she looked up again, there was something quieter in her expression, not acceptance, but recognition. The crowd remained still, but the stillness no longer felt uniform. It had begun to fracture into individual reactions that did not fully align, as though each person was silently renegotiating their understanding of what they were witnessing. Duke glanced across the street again, noticing this subtle shift, and for the first time his attention seemed divided between Ethan and the people who had once formed his silent support. Ethan continued, asking whether silence could truly be called agreement if it only existed because speaking carried consequences people were unwilling to face. The question lingered longer than the previous ones, not because it was louder, but because it made each listener evaluate their own position within it. Emily spoke again, more steadily now, asking if fear had become so normal here that people no longer recognized it as fear at all. That question did not target any one individual, yet it seemed to unsettle the crowd in a way earlier statements had not. A man near the edge of the boardwalk adjusted his hat and then stopped, as if unsure whether even small gestures might reveal too much. Duke finally responded with a controlled tone, saying that fear was a natural part of any place where people depended on each other for survival, and that acknowledging it did not change its necessity. Ethan replied that acknowledging fear was different from allowing it to define every decision a community made, and that distinction was what often determined whether a place remained static or grew beyond its own limitations. Emily looked toward the crowd again, noticing how many eyes now avoided not only Duke, but also each other, as if silent alignment had begun to lose its certainty. The wind moved through the street again, but even that movement felt subdued, like it was careful not to disturb what was developing between them. Duke's posture shifted slightly, no longer fully facing Ethan, but not turning away either, as if he was holding position in a space that was no longer entirely stable. Ethan remained still, but his presence continued to define the center of attention without effort, not through force, but through consistency. Emily finally said softly that it felt like everyone here had been taught the same silence without ever being asked whether they wanted to learn it, and that realization seemed to settle over her more heavily than anything else she had experienced that day. The crowd did not respond, yet their silence now carried hesitation rather than certainty, as if something unspoken had begun to loosen but had not yet decided how to break. Redwood Crossing remained quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of agreement. It was the quiet of something beginning to question itself. The silence that had been holding Redwood Crossing together began to lose its shape in ways no one could immediately name, as if the street itself had started to forget the rules it had followed for so long. Emily Carter stood closer to Ethan Brooks now than she had at any point since this began, not because she was protected in any physical sense, but because the space between them no longer felt like separation. Ethan remained steady, his attention moving across the street with a calm precision that made it clear he was not reacting to individuals anymore, but to something larger forming beneath their reactions. Duke Mallory noticed it too, though he tried not to show it. His posture remained controlled, but the subtle stillness in his stance suggested he was no longer directing the moment, only holding onto it. The crowd, once unified in its silence, now felt divided in ways that were not openly visible but deeply present. Some people still avoided eye contact entirely, while others glanced between Ethan, Duke, and Emily as if trying to determine where safety now existed. Emily finally spoke again, her voice softer but clearer than before, asking if silence had ever truly protected anyone in this town or if it had only ever protected the idea of order. The question did not echo loudly, yet it reached further than expected because it was no longer just a question about one moment, but about everything that had come before it. Ethan turned slightly toward her, acknowledging the weight of her words, and said that silence often began as protection but became habit when people stopped questioning its purpose. Duke responded after a brief pause, saying that habits existed because they worked, and that questioning them did not change the conditions that made them necessary. A faint shift moved through the crowd again, not visible as action, but noticeable in attention, as if people were beginning to listen differently than before. Emily looked out across them, no longer just seeing faces, but patterns of avoidance, recognition, and hesitation that had been invisible to her until now. Ethan continued, asking whether a habit built on fear could ever be considered stable, or whether it only appeared stable because no one challenged it long enough to test its limits. Duke's gaze hardened slightly, but his voice remained controlled as he said that challenging stability without understanding its cost was reckless, and that most places did not survive recklessness. Ethan did not argue immediately. Instead, he allowed a pause to settle, and in that pause, the street seemed to grow even quieter, not from agreement, but from anticipation. Emily shifted her stance slightly, now fully aligned with Ethan rather than the edge of the scene, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not uncertainty, but realization. She asked why it felt like everyone here had learned to treat fear as responsibility instead of recognizing it as something that could be questioned. That question seemed to unsettle the rhythm of the moment more than anything before it, because it reframed what had previously been accepted as unavoidable. A man near the far end of the street exhaled slowly, then looked away as if that small recognition had revealed something he was not prepared to confront publicly. Duke finally said that responsibility and fear were often the same thing in difficult places, and separating them was not always possible without consequences. Ethan responded quietly that if they were truly the same, then change would never be possible, because nothing could ever be questioned without threatening everything at once. Emily glanced toward the crowd again, noticing how fewer people were maintaining the same fixed posture of silence. Some had begun to shift their weight, others lowered their gaze in ways that suggested internal disagreement rather than collective agreement. The structure of the moment was no longer intact in the way it had been at the beginning. It was still quiet, but the quiet had become fragmented, no longer shared in the same way by everyone present. Duke looked across the street slowly, no longer focusing only on Ethan, but on the entire gathering, as if realizing that the authority he had relied on was not being actively challenged, but quietly re-evaluated. Ethan remained composed, his presence unchanged, but the effect he was having on the space around him continued to grow, not through force, but through consistency of perspective. Emily finally said, almost under her breath, that it felt like the town had never been asked to decide anything for itself, only to continue what had already been decided long ago. That realization seemed to settle over her fully now, not as confusion, but as clarity that could not be easily reversed. The street remained quiet, but the silence was no longer unified. It had become something uncertain, something that carried the weight of choices that had not yet been made but could no longer be avoided. The air in Redwood Crossing no longer felt like it belonged to any single person, and as Ethan Brooke stood facing Duke Mallory, that shift became more noticeable in the way the crowd no longer reacted as one unified presence. Emily Carter remained close enough to Ethan that she no longer felt isolated, yet distant enough to still observe everything unfolding with a clarity she had not possessed before. Duke's posture had grown increasingly measured, but there was a subtle tension in his stillness, as if he was aware that control was no longer something he could assume, only something he had to maintain through effort. Ethan spoke again, his voice steady and unforced, asking whether a community that depended entirely on silence could ever recognize when it was protecting something meaningful or simply preserving something familiar. The question did not rise in intensity, but it spread through the space between them in a way that made several people in the crowd shift their attention almost unconsciously. Emily looked across the street again, noticing how differently people were standing now, no longer aligned in shared stillness but separated by small signs of internal conflict. Duke responded after a brief pause, saying that familiarity was not the same as comfort, but it was often the only thing people had when uncertainty was too costly to manage. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with its conclusion, then said that familiarity could also become a barrier when it prevented people from recognizing alternatives that already existed in front of them. A quiet movement passed through the crowd, not visible as action, but as a subtle redistribution of attention, as if individuals were beginning to reconsider their positions independently rather than collectively. Emily spoke again, her voice more grounded now, asking why it felt like no one had ever been given a reason to believe that speaking differently was even an option. That question lingered in the space longer than anything else, because it did not challenge a specific person or moment, but the entire structure that had formed around them. A man near the general store shifted his stance and looked briefly toward another before lowering his gaze again, as if the idea of acknowledgement itself carried weight he was not ready to share. Duke finally replied, saying that options existed only when circumstances allowed them, and that most people in difficult environments learned quickly which options were real and which were not. Ethan responded quietly that what people believed to be possible was often shaped more by repetition than by reality itself. Emily absorbed those words slowly, as if comparing them to everything she had experienced since arriving in Redwood Crossing, and the comparison seemed to leave her more reflective than uncertain. The crowd remained silent, but the nature of that silence had changed again, becoming less uniform and more fragmented, as if each person was now carrying their own version of it rather than sharing one. Duke glanced across the street once more, no longer focusing solely on Ethan, but scanning the people who had once reinforced his position through their collective stillness. Ethan remained composed, his attention steady, not pushing forward but not stepping back either, maintaining a presence that seemed to define the center of the moment without needing to assert it. Emily finally said, almost quietly, that it felt like the town had never been asked to decide what it believed, only to continue responding to what it had already accepted. That realization seemed to settle into the space around her more deeply than any previous statement, as if it had been forming beneath everything else all along. A faint shift moved through the crowd again, subtle and uncertain, not yet visible as change but no longer entirely static either. The silence that followed was no longer just absence of sound, but something transitional, holding the weight of decisions that had begun to form without yet being spoken. The stillness that had settled over Redwood Crossing no longer felt like something imposed from the outside, but like something fragile that every person present was now trying to hold together in their own way, and that effort alone was beginning to change the nature of the moment. Ethan Brooke stood without movement, yet his presence continued to define the center of attention in a way that did not require force or interruption. Emily Carter remained beside him, her posture now more grounded than before, as if she had stopped waiting for permission to understand what she was seeing. Duke Mallory, however, no longer carried the same sense of control he had earlier, and although he maintained composure, there was a noticeable shift in how he was measuring both Ethan and the crowd. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice calm and even, asking whether a system built on unspoken rules could ever remain stable once people began to recognize the existence of alternatives. The question moved through the street slowly, not like a challenge, but like an observation that could not be easily dismissed. Emily looked across the crowd, noticing how several people were no longer maintaining the same fixed posture, instead adjusting their stance in small, uncertain ways that suggested internal reconsideration. Duke responded after a brief pause, saying that systems were not meant to be perfect, only functional, and that questioning their foundation often created more instability than improvement. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the logic without accepting its conclusion, then replied that functionality without awareness eventually becomes limitation rather than strength. A quiet shift passed through the crowd again, not dramatic, but noticeable in the way attention was no longer uniformly directed. Emily spoke softly, asking why it felt like everyone had learned to accept limits without ever being shown where those limits came from. That question lingered longer than expected because it did not challenge authority directly, but instead challenged the origin of acceptance itself. A man near the edge of the boardwalk adjusted his footing and briefly looked toward another person beside him before looking away again, as if even silent recognition carried weight he was not ready to share openly. Duke exhaled slowly and said that origins did not always matter when survival depended on what already existed, and that people rarely had the luxury of rewriting conditions they were born into. Ethan responded quietly that survival without understanding often turned into repetition without choice, and repetition without choice eventually stopped feeling like survival at all. Emily absorbed those words without speaking, her expression shifting slightly as if she was beginning to separate what she had lived from what she had assumed was inevitable. The crowd remained quiet, but the silence was no longer consistent. It had begun to fracture into smaller, individual silences, each carrying different levels of certainty and doubt. Duke glanced across the street again, no longer focusing solely on Ethan, but on the entire gathering, as if realizing that his influence was no longer being reinforced in the way it once had been. Ethan remained steady, not advancing and not retreating, but maintaining a presence that defined the space simply by remaining consistent within it. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady but reflective, saying that it felt like the town had never been asked to define what it believed, only to continue following what had already been established before anyone questioned it. That realization seemed to settle over the entire street in a deeper way than previous statements, not as confrontation, but as recognition that could not easily be reversed. A faint movement passed through the crowd again, subtle and uneven, suggesting that the structure of collective silence was no longer holding in the same way it had at the beginning. Duke stood still, but his attention had clearly expanded beyond Ethan alone, as if he was now aware that the true shift was occurring among the people rather than between individuals. Ethan looked briefly at Emily, then across the street, and said nothing further, allowing the silence itself to continue unfolding without interruption. In that moment, Redwood Crossing remained quiet, but the quiet no longer belonged to certainty. It had become something transitional, carrying within it the weight of decisions that had already begun forming without yet being spoken aloud. The atmosphere in Redwood Crossing had shifted again, not suddenly, but in a slow and almost imperceptible way, like something heavy in the air had begun to redistribute itself among everyone standing on the wooden street. Ethan Brooks remained still, his attention steady, not focused on any single person but on the way the moment itself was changing shape. Emily Carter stood beside him, no longer appearing lost in the situation, but instead observing it with a clarity that had not been present earlier. Duke Mallory, however, had begun to show signs that were no longer subtle, not in movement, but in how frequently his attention shifted across the crowd instead of remaining anchored. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled, asking whether a community that depended on silence for stability could continue functioning once that silence was no longer shared equally among its people. The question moved slowly through the street, and for the first time, it did not feel like it belonged only to the conversation between two men, but to everyone listening. Emily turned her gaze across the crowd and noticed something she had not fully recognized before, that people were no longer standing as a single group. Instead, they were beginning to exist as individuals within the same space, each carrying their own interpretation of what had been said. Duke responded after a pause, saying that stability was not built on perfect agreement, but on predictable behavior, and that unpredictability was what turned order into uncertainty. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement, then replied that predictability without understanding eventually turned into limitation, because it removed the possibility of choice from the people living within it. A faint shift moved through the crowd again, this time more visible in posture and attention. Some people looked directly at Ethan for longer than before, while others avoided looking at Duke entirely, as if the direction of their focus was beginning to change without instruction. Emily spoke again, her voice steady but reflective, asking why it felt like everyone had learned to accept limits they never personally agreed to, as if agreement had been assumed rather than chosen. That question lingered in the air longer than the previous ones, because it touched something foundational, not about authority, but about inheritance of behavior. A man near the back of the crowd adjusted his stance and briefly looked toward another person beside him, then looked away. Again, suggesting a moment of silent recognition that was not yet ready to become visible action. Duke finally said that people did not always choose their circumstances, and that survival often meant adapting to conditions that could not be changed through questioning alone. Ethan responded quietly that adaptation without awareness eventually becomes repetition, and repetition without awareness removes the difference between choice and condition. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, then looked up again, her expression showing a transition from uncertainty toward understanding that was still forming but no longer fragile. The crowd remained silent, but the silence was no longer consistent. It had begun to split into smaller, individual forms, each carrying different levels of agreement, doubt, or hesitation. Duke's attention moved across the crowd again, and for the first time, it was clear that he was no longer only measuring Ethan, but the stability of the people around them. Ethan remained composed, neither advancing nor withdrawing, maintaining a presence that did not demand attention but continued to hold it. Emily finally spoke again, saying that it felt like the town had never been asked what it believed, only trained to continue what it had already been doing before anyone questioned it. That realization seemed to settle over the entire space in a deeper way than before, not as confrontation, but as recognition that could not be easily reversed once understood. A subtle movement passed through the crowd again, uneven and quiet, suggesting that the structure of shared silence was no longer functioning in the same way it had at the beginning. Duke stood still, but his attention was no longer contained to Ethan alone, as if he now understood that the shift was occurring collectively rather than individually. Ethan looked briefly at Emily, then across the street, and said nothing further, allowing the silence to continue on its own without direction. In that extended quiet, Redwood Crossing remained still, but the stillness no longer carried certainty. It carried transition, as if the town itself was standing in a moment where something long accepted was no longer guaranteed to continue. The silence in Redwood Crossing had reached a point where it no longer felt like something holding the town together, but something that was beginning to strain under its own weight, as if every person standing on that wooden street was now aware that it could no longer remain unchanged. Ethan Brooks stood in the center of that tension without moving, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but continued to hold it naturally, as if the space itself had adjusted around him rather than the other way around. Emily Carter remained beside him, no longer uncertain in her position, but still absorbing everything with a quiet intensity that came from seeing a system for what it was rather than what it had been presented to be. Duke Mallory finally shifted his stance forward slightly, not in aggression, but in a deliberate attempt to reassert presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried a controlled firmness that tried to restore structure to the moment. He said that conversation could continue indefinitely, but the reality of Redwood Crossing had never been shaped by conversation alone, and that people survived here because they understood when discussion ended and responsibility began. The words moved across the street with practiced authority, and for a brief moment, some in the crowd seemed to return to familiar patterns of attention, as if recognizing a tone they had heard many times before. Ethan listened without interruption, then responded calmly, asking whether responsibility meant accepting silence when something unjust was happening in plain view, or whether responsibility meant being willing to acknowledge what others refused to say aloud. That question did not rise in intensity, but it disrupted the rhythm Duke was trying to restore. Emily looked across the crowd again, noticing how reactions were no longer synchronized, some people still aligned with Duke's framing, others clearly uncertain, and a growing number no longer showing clear agreement with either side. Duke exhaled slowly and said that idealism did not sustain communities, that structure did, and structure required consistency even when individuals disagreed with it. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the logic but not accepting its limitation, then said that structure built on unspoken pressure eventually stopped being structure and became expectation without choice. A faint ripple passed through the crowd again, this time more visible in the way people adjusted their footing or looked briefly at one another before returning their gaze forward. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady but reflective, asking whether anyone in Redwood Crossing had ever actually been given a moment where they could choose differently, or whether every choice had already been shaped by what came before. That question seemed to settle deeper than the previous ones, because it did not challenge behavior, but origin. Duke's expression tightened slightly, and for the first time, his response did not come immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, controlled but less certain, saying that choice always existed, but it was limited by consequence, and ignoring consequence was not wisdom but recklessness. Ethan responded quietly that consequence was real, but it was not the same as permission, and confusing the two was what kept systems from ever being questioned honestly. The crowd remained silent, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer uniform or shared in the same way. Instead, it had become uneven, fragmented, as if each person was holding their own version of it. Emily looked across them and saw something she had not seen before, not a single community reacting together, but individuals standing inside the same space, processing the same moment differently. Duke looked across the entire street now, no longer focused solely on Ethan, and there was a subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was aware the foundation he had relied on was no longer responding as expected. Ethan remained steady, his attention calm and continuous, not pushing the moment forward but allowing it to continue unfolding without interruption. Emily spoke one final time in this stretch, her voice quiet but clear, saying that it felt like the town had never been asked to define what it believed, only to continue. Repeating what had already been defined before anyone thought to question it. That realization did not create reaction, but it created stillness of a different kind, one that felt less like agreement and more like recognition that could no longer be reversed. The wind moved lightly through the street again, carrying dust across the wooden boards, and even that movement felt different now, as if the space itself was no longer aligned with certainty but with something unresolved, something that had begun to form without yet revealing what it would become. The moment that followed in Redwood Crossing did not announce itself with sound or movement, yet everyone standing on the wooden street felt it as a clear and undeniable shift, as if something that had been held in place for too long had finally begun to settle into a new position. Ethan Brooks remained where he had been, steady and unchanging, not because he was forcing the moment to hold, but because he did not need to move for the moment to continue unfolding around him. Emily Carter stood beside him now with a stillness that no longer carried confusion, only awareness, as if she was seeing both the town and herself through a different understanding that could not be reversed. Duke Mallory looked across the crowd again, and this time there was no confidence in the motion, only observation, as if he was realizing that attention no longer responded to him in the same way it once had. The silence that had defined Redwood Crossing for so long was still present, but it had changed its meaning entirely, no longer acting as a shared agreement but as a space filled with individual thought that had not yet been spoken aloud. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, asking whether a place could truly remain the same once the people within it began to see that silence was not unity, but habit. The question did not carry pressure, but it did not need to, because it reflected what many were already beginning to recognize on their own. Emily looked across the street and saw something she had not seen before, not a crowd bound together by silence, but separate individuals standing within the same space, each processing the moment differently, each carrying their own hesitation. Duke responded after a long pause, his voice controlled but less certain than before, saying that change was always possible, but it rarely came without cost, and that cost was something most people were not willing to accept. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the truth of consequence without accepting its limitation as an excuse for inaction, and said that cost did not disappear when people refused to speak, it only became invisible while continuing to exist. A faint shift moved through the crowd again, not as movement, but as recognition, as if the idea that silence had weight was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady and clear, asking what would happen if no one here continued repeating what had always been done, even for just one moment. That question did not challenge authority directly, but it challenged continuity, and that made it land more deeply than anything before it. A man near the edge of the boardwalk exhaled slowly, then looked at another person beside him, and for the first time, that glance was met instead of avoided, even if only briefly. Duke turned slightly toward the crowd again, but the response he seemed to expect was no longer forming in the way it once did, and that absence itself became its own kind of answer. Ethan remained still, not directing, Not correcting, only present, as if allowing the moment to reveal what it would become without interference. Emily took a small step forward, no longer uncertain, and said quietly that she no longer believed silence was something people were born into, but something they learned without being told they were learning it. That realization seemed to settle across the entire street in a way that did not create immediate reaction, but instead created space for reflection that had not existed before. Duke looked at Ethan for a long moment, then across the crowd, and finally down at the wooden boards beneath his feet, and in that movement there was no confrontation left, only recognition that the structure he had relied on was no longer responding as it once had. Ethan finally turned his gaze toward Emily, not to direct her, but to acknowledge that she had reached her own understanding without being led to it, and in that shared stillness something changed that no one needed to announce. The crowd remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt imposed or shared in the same way. It felt open, uncertain, and for the first time in Redwood Crossing, it felt as if what came next would no longer be decided by habit alone, but by choice that had finally become visible to those willing to see it.